The church bells rang out across the Yorkshire moors, clear and defiant in the December cold. Reverend Thomas Hartley stood at the altar of St. Mary's, holding a marriage certificate that would tear his village apart. The groom wore a borrowed suit, civilian clothes that couldn't quite hide his prisoner of war posture. The bride wore her mother's wedding dress, white lace, and determination. They were holding hands. The church was empty except for 2 witnesses. Outside, half the village had gathered to protest. It was 1947, and Britain was still counting its dead. The war had ended 2 years ago, but the wounds were fresh, the losses too recent, the hatred too raw. This was about love in a time that had no room for forgiveness, about 2 people who'd chosen each other over everything else. Thomas had performed hundreds of marriages in his 40 years as rector. He'd never performed one like this. He'd known Margaret since she was born. Sweet girl, bright as a button, always with her nose in a book. She'd been 19 when the German prisoners arrived at Thornfield Camp in 1944, working on her father's farm while her brothers fought overseas. Her father, Colonel James Hartley, Thomas's younger brother, had commanded the POW camp with rigid military discipline. 16 prisoners assigned to agricultural work, strictly supervised, no fraternization permitted. Those were the rules. Rules that Margaret and a young German corporal named Heinrich Weber would break completely. Thomas had spent 3 years watching this impossible love story unfold, watching his brother rage against it, watching the village turn against his niece. He'd counselled them to give up, to be sensible, to understand that some loves weren't worth the cost. They'd listened politely and ignored every word. And now, here they were, about to commit to each other in front of God and a hostile world, and Thomas had to decide if he had the courage to marry them. The photograph on his desk told him he did. His own son, killed at Dunkirk in 1940. 22 years old, barely more than a boy. Would Thomas want someone to hate his son forever for the uniform he'd worn? Would he want the world to deny him a second chance, deny him love, deny him redemption? The answer was no. The answer had always been no. But standing here now, hearing the angry voices outside, feeling the weight of his brother's fury and the village's condemnation, Thomas wondered if he was doing the right thing. Or if he was about to destroy everything he'd spent a lifetime building. He looked at Margaret, saw the fear in her eyes, saw the steel beneath it, looked at Heinrich, saw the same. "Dearly beloved," Thomas began, and outside, someone threw a rock through the window. The story had started 3 years earlier, in the summer of 1944. The war was still raging, but Britain was winning now. The tide had turned after D-Day, and prisoners were flooding in by the thousands. Camp Thornfield, hastily erected on the edge of Colonel Hartley's farm, housed 60 German POWs, mostly captured in France. They worked the fields, picked vegetables, repaired fences, labour Britain desperately needed with so many men overseas. Colonel Hartley ran the camp like he'd run his regiment. Strict, fair, by the book. No fraternization between prisoners and civilians. No exceptions. His daughter Margaret helped manage the farm, doing the work her 3 brothers would have done if they weren't fighting in Europe. She was 19, strong from outdoor work, clever with machinery, independent in the way war had forced young women to become. Heinrich Weber was prisoner number 19264, a 23-year-old corporal from Hamburg who'd been a university student before the war. He'd studied literature and philosophy, dreamed of being a teacher, and instead found himself in Wehrmacht Grey, fighting a war he didn't believe in. Captured at Caen during the Normandy campaign, relieved to be alive, resigned to spending the rest of the war behind barbed wire. They met in August, in the potato field behind the barn. Margaret was driving the tractor, and Heinrich was part of the harvest crew. The tractor broke down, a seized bearing that would take hours to fix. Margaret started the repair herself, stripping the housing with practiced efficiency, Heinrich, who'd worked in his father's machine shop as a boy, recognized what she was doing wrong. Entschuldigung, he said carefully in his limited English. The bearing, you must to cool first. The metal, it expands in heat. Margaret looked up, startled. Prisoners weren't supposed to speak to civilians unless spoken to. But the man wasn't being forward, just helpful. And he was right. She'd been about to strip the threads, trying to force the hot bearing. Thank you, she said. Do you know engines? In Germany, I work with my father. Machines, engines, all things mechanical. They spent the next hour fixing the tractor together, communicating in broken English and hand gestures, finding a common language in the universal logic of mechanical repair. When they finished, the tractor ran smoothly. When they finished, something else had started. Colonel Hartley found out about the conversation that evening. His foreman reported it, technically a violation of the non-fraternization rules. The colonel brought Heinrich into his office, delivered a sharp reprimand, and assigned him to a different work detail, far from Margaret. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. They saw each other 3 days later, at the village shop. Margaret was buying supplies. Heinrich was part of a supervised group allowed to purchase toiletries. Their eyes met across the shop floor. Heinrich nodded politely. Margaret looked away, but something had been set in motion that neither of them could stop. Over the following months, they found ways to see each other. Brief encounters, always in public, always with proper distance. A few words exchanged in the farmyard. A shared glance at church on Sunday, where prisoners were allowed to attend services. Letters passed secretly through a sympathetic guard, a young corporal named Davies who believed the war had produced enough hatred without adding more. The letters were careful, proper, discussing books and philosophy and the small observations of daily life. Nothing romantic, nothing that could be called inappropriate, but with each letter, something deepened. With each stolen conversation, something grew. By December 1944, they were in love. Neither had said it aloud. Neither had to. Margaret's friend, Sarah Bolton, was the first to notice. Sarah had known Margaret since childhood, and she saw the changes. The way Margaret's eyes searched the farm looking for a particular prisoner, the way she lit up when she spotted him, the way she found excuses to be where he was working. "You're playing with fire," Sarah told her one afternoon as they worked together in the dairy. "Your father will kill you. The village will turn on you. And that German will be sent away to another camp or worse." "I know," Margaret said quietly. "I know all of that." "Then stop. Whatever this is, stop it before it goes too far." "It's already too far," Margaret said. "I can't explain it, Sarah. I didn't choose this. It chose me. Choose us. He's not the enemy. He's just a man who got caught up in something bigger than himself. Like my brothers. Like all of us." "Your brothers are fighting Germans like him," Sarah said, her voice sharp. "How can you betray them like this?" "I'm not betraying anyone. I'm just refusing to hate someone for being born in the wrong country. Is that so terrible?" Sarah didn't answer, but she didn't report Margaret either. Friendship, in the end, trumped judgment. The village, however, was less forgiving. By February 1945, rumours had started circulating. Someone had seen Margaret and Heinrich talking by the barn. Someone else had noticed them at church. The whispers grew louder. Colonel Hartley's daughter and a German prisoner. The words dripped with scandal and disgust. Colonel Hartley heard the rumours and confronted Margaret directly. It was a cold February evening in the farmhouse study where he'd raised her after her mother died. The same room where he'd taught her to read, where they'd listened to the wireless together, where he'd told her about her brother's deployments. "Tell me the rumours aren't true," he said, his voice hard. Margaret stood straight, met his eyes. "Which rumours? Don't play games with me, Margaret. Are you involved with that German prisoner, the one from Hamburg?" "His name is Heinrich, and yes, I care about him." The colonel's face went white with fury. You care about him? He's the enemy, Margaret. The enemy! Men like him killed your cousins, bombed our cities, tried to destroy everything we stand for, and you care about him? He didn't bomb our cities. He didn't kill anyone. He was a conscript who never wanted to fight. He's a good man, Father. If you would just talk to him. I will not talk to him. I will not acknowledge this obscenity, and you will end it immediately. That's an order. I'm not one of your soldiers, Margaret said quietly. You can't order me to stop caring about someone. I can, and I am. If you don't end this voluntarily, I'll have him transferred to a camp in Scotland. Tonight. You'll never see him again. Margaret felt something break inside her. Don't do that. Please. Father, I'm begging you. Then end it. She looked at her father, at the man who'd raised her with love and strictness in equal measure, and saw no compromise in his eyes, no understanding, no mercy. I can't, she said. I'm sorry, but I can't. The colonel stood up, walked to the window, stood with his back to her. Then you leave me no choice. Weber will be transferred tomorrow, and you, Margaret, are no longer welcome in this house. Pack your things. You have until morning. The words hung in the air like poison. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face. You're disowning me? Your own daughter? You disowned this family when you chose a German over your own blood. Get out! Margaret left that night with one suitcase and Sarah Bolton's promise of a spare room. The next morning, Heinrich was transferred to a camp in Lanarkshire, 300 miles away. They didn't get to say goodbye. The village's reaction was swift and brutal. Margaret was cut off from her family, shunned in shops, whispered about in church. People who'd known her all her life crossed the street to avoid her. Children threw stones at Sarah's house. Anonymous letters arrived, calling her a traitor and worse. Sarah's own family pressured her to throw Margaret out. Sarah refused. She's my friend, she told her mother firmly. I don't care what the village thinks. She needs someone, and I'm not going to abandon her. But the pressure was enormous. Sarah lost her position at the village school. Parents didn't want their children taught by someone who harboured a German sympathiser. The Bolton family grocer began losing customers. Sarah's younger brother came home with a black eye, beaten up for defending his sister. I can't let you suffer for me, Margaret told Sarah one evening, 6 weeks after she'd been thrown out. I should leave. Go to London, start over somewhere no one knows me. And leave him behind? Sarah asked. Is that what you want? Margaret was silent. Then, no. But I don't know what else to do. I can't see him. I can't write to him. The camp blocks my letters. I don't even know if he still thinks about me. Of course he thinks about you, Sarah said. Love doesn't just disappear because someone moved a man 300 miles away. She was right. Heinrich thought about Margaret constantly, through the long Scottish winter, through the spring when the war finally ended in Europe, through the summer when the prisoners learnt they'd be repatriated soon. He wrote letters he couldn't send, kept them in a notebook under his mattress. 37 letters over 16 months, all saying the same thing in different ways. I love you. I miss you. I'll find a way back to you. The war ended in May 1945. By August, German prisoners were being sent home in waves. Heinrich's group was scheduled for October repatriation. He had 2 months to find Margaret, to somehow get back to Yorkshire, to tell her what he'd written in 37 unsent letters. He couldn't leave the camp, couldn't travel without permission, couldn't do anything except wait for his deportation to a Germany that no longer existed, to a Hamburg that had been bombed to rubble, to a family he didn't know if he'd ever see again. Then Corporal Davies appeared at the camp. Davies had been transferred to the Lanarkshire facility 3 months earlier, and he'd watched Heinrich deteriorate with longing and despair. Davies, who'd lost his own fiancée to a German bomb in 1940, had every reason to hate German prisoners. But somewhere along the way, he'd learned that hatred was exhausting, that holding grudges hurt him more than anyone else, that maybe the way forward was forgiveness. I've been thinking, Davies told Heinrich one September afternoon. About second chances, about what matters and what doesn't. And I've decided that what matters is people who love each other getting a fair shot. Heinrich looked up, not understanding. I'm going to Yorkshire next week. Leave time, visiting my mum. I could carry a letter for you, deliver it personally to a certain young woman, if you wanted. Heinrich stared at him. Why would you do this, after everything? Davies shrugged. Because the war's over, mate, and because I'm tired of suffering. If I can help someone be less miserable than I am, maybe that's worth something. Maybe that's how we start fixing things. The letter Heinrich wrote was 10 pages long, everything he'd been holding inside for 16 months. He told Margaret about the 37 letters, about the notebook under his mattress, about loving her every single day they'd been apart. He told her he was being sent back to Germany in October, that he didn't know if he'd survive the chaos, that he had to see her one more time before he left. He told her he understood if she'd moved on, if she didn't want to see him, if she thought it was hopeless. But if there was any chance at all, he'd find a way back to Yorkshire. He just needed to know she still wanted him to come. Davies delivered the letter in person. Found Sarah's house, knocked on the door, handed the letter to Margaret and said simply, "He loves you. Thought you should know." Margaret read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face. Then she sat down and wrote her reply. 3 words. Come back. Please. Getting Heinrich from Scotland to Yorkshire required a level of bureaucratic manoeuvring that should have been impossible. But Davies was resourceful, and he wasn't working alone anymore. He recruited other guards who were sympathetic, forged transfer papers, arranged a temporary agricultural labour assignment in Yorkshire that would give Heinrich 2 weeks in the area before his scheduled repatriation. It was technically illegal. It was definitely against regulations. It could cost Davies his position and possibly criminal charges. He did it anyway. Heinrich arrived in Yorkshire in late September 1945, 4 months after the war ended, 16 months after he'd last seen Margaret. They met at the church, St Mary's, because it was neutral ground and because Reverend Thomas Hartley, Margaret's uncle, had agreed to let them use the building. They stood in the empty church, 10 feet apart, looking at each other across 16 months of separation and suffering. Neither knew what to say first. How do you compress 16 months of longing into words? Margaret spoke first. You came back. I said I would. I didn't know if you meant it. If you could. I meant it, Heinrich said. I would have walked if I had to. They closed the distance then, and Margaret was in his arms, and he was holding her like she might disappear if he let go, and neither of them cared that it was improper or scandalous, or that the whole village would hear about it by morning. What do we do now? Margaret asked, her face against his chest. I don't know. I have 2 weeks before they send me back to Germany. After that, he didn't finish. After that was too uncertain, too frightening. Then we have 2 weeks, Margaret said. What can we do in 2 weeks? Reverend Thomas Hartley, who'd been watching from the vestry, stepped out. He'd let them use the church because he believed in second chances, because he'd lost his own son to the war and refused to add more tragedy to the ledger. But he was also practical. In 2 weeks, Thomas said, you can get married. They both turned, startled. Thomas walked toward them, his expression serious. You can get married, he repeated. If Heinrich marries a British citizen, he has legal grounds to request permission to stay in the country. It's not guaranteed, but it's a chance. Without it, he'll be deported. And you'll likely never see each other again. With it, you might have a future. My father would never allow it, Margaret said. Your father has no legal say. You're over 21. You don't need his permission. Thomas paused. You'll need mine, though. I'd have to perform the ceremony, and I'd have to be willing to face the consequences. What consequences? Heinrich asked. The village will turn on me. My own brother will never speak to me again. I'll lose half my congregation. I might lose my position as rector, but I've been thinking a lot about consequences lately, about what we do with the end of a war, about whether we choose to keep hating or start healing." He looked at them both. "I choose healing. If you two want to get married, I'll marry you. But you need to understand what you're asking for. The village won't accept this. Your life here will be hard. People you've known all your life will treat you like strangers. Are you prepared for that?" Margaret and Heinrich looked at each other. 16 months apart had given them perspective. They knew what mattered. "Yes," Margaret said. "Yes," Heinrich echoed. "Then we'll do it," Thomas said. "But we need to move quickly, before anyone can stop us." They planned the wedding for 2 weeks later, December the 1st, 1945, just enough time to complete the legal paperwork, post the banns, meet the requirements. Thomas worked through bureaucratic channels, calling in favours, pulling strings, making things happen that shouldn't have been possible. The village found out within days. The reaction was explosive. Colonel Hartley confronted his brother at the rectory, their argument heard 3 houses away. "You're marrying her to a German? Have you lost your mind, Thomas? He's the enemy." "The war is over, James. There are no more enemies, just people trying to survive. I'll stop this. I'll go to the bishop. I'll have you removed from your position." "Do what you have to do," Thomas said calmly. "I'm doing what I believe is right." The colonel stormed out and immediately contacted every authority he could think of: the bishop, the local magistrate, the Home Office, anyone who might have the power to stop the wedding. But the paperwork was in order, the law was clear, and nobody had grounds to intervene. The village organised protests. A petition circulated demanding Thomas be removed as rector. Angry meetings were held in the village hall. People who'd been neighbours for decades turned on each other, arguing about loyalty and forgiveness and whether love could transcend war. Sarah Bolton's family finally gave her an ultimatum: throw Margaret out or leave yourself. Sarah chose Margaret, moved into a small cottage on the edge of the village, continued to support her friend despite losing almost everything. Corporal Davies was court-martialed for falsifying Heinrich's transfer papers. He was dishonourably discharged, lost his pension, faced possible jail time. At his hearing, he said simply, "I helped 2 people who loved each other. I'd do it again." The sentence was suspended. The commanding officer, a veteran of the Great War who'd seen enough suffering, let him go with a warning and a note in his file. Davies found work as a mechanic in Yorkshire, never regretted what he'd done. On the morning of December the 1st, 1945, Margaret woke in Sarah's cottage knowing that in a few hours everything would change. She'd be married to Heinrich or she wouldn't. They'd have a chance at a future, or they'd be torn apart forever. There was no middle ground left. She put on her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved for 20 years. Sarah helped with the buttons, her hands shaking. "Are you sure?" Sarah asked one final time. "I've never been more sure of anything," Margaret said. At the church, Heinrich waited with Davies and Thomas. Outside, the crowd had gathered. 50 or 60 people, some holding signs, others just there to witness the scandal. A few rocks had already been thrown. The constable stood at the church gate, trying to keep order. "We can call it off," Thomas offered, "if you think this is too dangerous." "No," Heinrich said. "We go forward." Margaret arrived with Sarah at noon. The crowd parted reluctantly, hostility radiating from every face. Someone spat at her. Someone called her a traitor. Sarah gripped her arm tighter, and they kept walking. Inside the church, it was quiet, sacred, just the 4 of them and God. Thomas opened his prayer book. The window shattered, rock and broken glass scattered across the floor. Thomas didn't even pause. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today in the sight of God to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony. Marriage is not to be entered into lightly, but reverently, deliberately, and in accordance with the purposes for which it was instituted by God." Outside, the shouting grew louder. Someone was trying to force the church door. The constable held them back, barely. Heinrich Wilhelm Weber, do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do you part? I do, Heinrich said, his voice steady. Margaret Ann Hartley, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do you part? I do, Margaret said, tears streaming down her face. Then, by the power vested in me by the Church of England and the laws of this land, I pronounce you husband and wife. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder. They kissed as another window shattered. They kissed as the crowd outside roared disapproval. They kissed as the old world crumbled and a new one tried to be born. The aftermath was brutal and beautiful in equal measure. Heinrich's petition to remain in Britain was granted, barely. The Home Office official who approved it noted that while he found the situation distasteful, the law was clear. Margaret, as a British citizen, had the right to marry whom she chose, and her husband had the right to residency. Colonel Hartley never spoke to his daughter again, never met his son-in-law, never acknowledged the 3 grandchildren who came later. He died in 1958, bitter and alone, having chosen pride over love. The village ostracised Margaret and Heinrich for years. They couldn't find housing, no landlord would rent to them. They couldn't find work, no one would hire a German, especially one who'd married locally. They survived on Sarah's support and odd jobs in neighbouring towns until 1948, when a sympathetic Quaker family sold them a small farm on the outskirts of the village at a price they could afford. They worked that farm for 35 years, raised 3 children, 2 daughters and a son, built a life from nothing through sheer determination and love. Heinrich became a British citizen in 1950, started a small machinery repair business in 1955 that eventually employed a dozen people, served on the village council in 1965, the first former POW to do so. The village thawed slowly. Some people never forgave them, but others, especially the younger generation, came to see their story differently. Not as betrayal, but as courage. Not as scandal, but as hope. By 1970, Margaret and Heinrich were respected members of the community. Their children married local people. Their grandchildren attended the village school. The wounds hadn't healed completely, wounds that deep never do, but they'd scarred over. The pain had dulled. Reverend Thomas Hartley was nearly removed from his position in 1946, saved only by a vocal minority of his congregation who argued that a rector who practiced forgiveness was exactly what a post-war Britain needed. He served St. Mary's until 1968, never regretted marrying Margaret and Heinrich, and baptised all 3 of their children. Sarah Bolton married Corporal Davies in 1948. They ran a small garage together, remained Margaret and Heinrich's closest friends until they died within months of each other in 1982. The story of the German POW who married his captor's daughter became village legend, told and retold until fact and fiction blurred. But the truth remained, preserved in church records and faded photographs, and the memories of those who'd been there. Margaret and Heinrich lived together for 52 years. He died in 1997. She followed in 1999. They were buried in St. Mary's churchyard, side by side, their joint headstone reading simply, "Together against the world." At Margaret's funeral, the church was packed. 3 children, 8 grandchildren, 12 great-grandchildren. Half the village attended, including the granddaughter of the colonel who'd disowned her. The new rector spoke about love that transcends boundaries, about courage to choose hope over hatred, about the slow work of healing. Someone asked Margaret once in her 80s if she'd do it all again, knowing what it would cost. The ostracism, the struggle, the decades of hard work and social isolation. She didn't hesitate. "Every single day," she said. "Love isn't easy. Real love costs something. But Heinrich was worth it. Our life together was worth it. I wouldn't trade a single moment, not even the hard ones." That was her legacy. Not just that she loved a man she wasn't supposed to love, but that she loved him enough to pay the price. That she chose love when the world chose hate. That she built a bridge across the chasm of war when everyone else was content to keep the distance. Her story reminds us that the most radical act is sometimes simply to love. To refuse to let hatred win. To choose compassion over judgment, understanding over condemnation, hope over despair. In 1945, a young woman and a young man stood in a church while a village raged outside, and they chose each other. They chose love, and in doing so, they chose a better future for all of us. If you found this story compelling, make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts on Margaret and Heinrich's incredible journey. Have you ever had to choose love over everything else? Let us know below.